GrantShapps is former British Secretary of Defense. Welcome to our program, Mr. Shapps.
Thank you very much. Thanks for having me on.
What are the chances for a ceasefire in Ukraine this year?
Well, look, I mean, clearly there's been a huge amount of bloodshed, and everyone wants to see the conflict come to an end. I think it has to come to an end in a just way from the perspective of both Ukraine, which after all is the country which has unambiguously been invaded, and also from our wider security as those of us who live on the European continent. I have some deep concerns about the potential shape of that peace settlement, but we will have to see because it's too early to know at this stage exactly what that would look at. Or everyone would welcome peace, but I don't think it should be peace at any price. And in particular, we shouldn't let a dictator in Putin feel like he's had the upper hand, because that would be serious for future conflicts.
Do you believe that US President Donald Trump can really bring Vladimir Putin to the negotiating table and force him to make a serious peace deal?
Well, I'm certain that he'll bring him to the negotiating table. What worries me is that he may do that by making too many concessions on behalf of Ukraine and indeed without Ukraine in advance of those discussions. President Trump is often certainly describes himself as an expert negotiator. It's an unusual negotiation in which you give up a number of cards in advance of sitting down at the table. So I make no bones about it. I've been concerned with some of the things that he's been saying. On the other hand, this has been a long time in coming. Clearly, no one wants to see bloodshed. So again, it's hard to know without seeing the outcome and the shape of such a deal. But I have some significant misgivings about it, if I'm being honest.
Do you feel that US President Trump has already gave up some cards to Vladimir Putin by ruling out membership in NATO and also making other statements about the Ukrainian ability to regain its own territories?
Yes, I do. And I think the problem, though, is that Europe, for far too long, has talked about security, but not been prepared to spend money on it. Europe spent on defense at about the same level as the Americans, say 3.5% or something of their GDP on defense. We wouldn't be in this position. We wouldn't be reliant on the Americans. We wouldn't be subject to America, a country which isn't even on our continent, drawing the boundaries of countries, Ukraine in this case, Ukraine and Russia. So we are responsible for this ourselves in the end result as Europe, for not having spent enough money on defense over a sufficient period of time. And I say that as somebody who was formerly the defense secretary for Europe's biggest spender in financial terms in Europe. But even I don't think we were spending enough as Britain, and certainly not enough as the rest of Europe.
Also, do you feel that Ukraine has now its own seat on the negotiating table?
Well, I mean, absolutely essential. Ukraine is there. You cannot have a peace without a country that's been invaded sitting around a table. And I do worry, and I'm going to say this out loud to you. I do worry that President Trump, who thinks himself a master at making deals, seems to be far too close to President Putin on this. President Putin invaded. There was no vacation. There was no excuse. He's broken international law. He's sent hundreds of thousands of Russians to their death, and of course caused the deaths of many Ukrainians as well. He is a dictator who doesn't just cancel or run rather illegitimate elections. He murders his opponents and knocks them up as well. It's the idea the leader of the free world can't distinguish between who the dictator is here is absolutely abhorrent. And so it is essential. And whilst I would welcome a peace, it needs to be a just peace. Otherwise, Putin will simply take the time to regather and try and come back again and come back stronger. I think it is concerning that Ukraine was locked out of the initial discussions. I believe that will change. I think we'll see President Zelenskyy in Washington by the end of the week. And I hope when that happens, that there's a change in tone and all of this turns out to have been a masterful negotiating technique by President Trump. My concern is that that's not the way it looks at the moment.
US President Donald Trump said that he was confident that Vladimir Putin would accept European peacekeeping forces in Ukraine. Can you imagine a scenario in which Putin says okay to European peacekeeping forces in Ukraine?
Yeah, I can actually, and I think part of the conversation is likely to be true. Um, the question always on these things is what has to be given up in return for peace. And I suspect the kind of deal the president has in mind is that President Putin, Russia, keeps territory that it invaded, well, actually all the way back to 2014, in some cases like Crimea, in return for a peace, which in return would probably be secured by having European forces on the ground, and essentially also it will require American security guarantees. Otherwise, President Putin would, I'm sure, think nothing after a period of time of trying to push further again. So this all depends on the terms on which such a deal is struck. And I have always felt that in the end, this is your country. Ukraine belongs to the Ukrainians. It's up to you if you want to accept the long-awaited peace in return for territory, and that shouldn't be other countries forcing you to do that. And it's certainly something that the United Kingdom, as I think and believe, the number one supporter of Ukraine in this war, should never push you to do if it's against your own interests. That has to be a judgment for Ukraine and the Ukrainian people.
The United Kingdom, France, and other allies are ready to deploy troops to Ukraine, up to 30,000 troops, according to the recent publication in the media. Also, British Prime Minister Keir Starmer will present his plan to Donald Trump this week about deployment of European peacekeeping forces. And my first question will be, is British Army capable of conducting such large-scale operations on the ground in Ukraine without American role?
Yes, we are, is the answer. And a lot is made of the size of, yes, I've been defense secretary, these conversations have happened many times over. A lot is made about the size specifically of the British Army. And then a lot of people conflate the army to be the entire military. We spend about £66 billion. That's probably, to the top of my head, 75, 80 billion euros a year on our military. We are pretty significant, as I say, the second biggest spenders, or the biggest spender in Europe, second biggest in NATO outside of America. And when it comes to troops, although, of course, people like me who've been defense secretary always want to see more troops in place, we have, for example, a rapid reaction force with France, which can produce 10,000 troops very quickly. We've been looking for contributions from all European states, of course, who are, after all, should be interested in securing the peace in Europe. So we'd be expecting everyone to contribute. But yes, I do think it would be doable. Again, though, none of us has seen the details of an agreement yet, because there isn't one. So the only way that we could, a British Prime Minister, would send troops would be if the wider security situation has been properly negotiated and is being guaranteed by the Americans.
Also, British Prime Minister will ask Donald Trump to commit and to support this mission, for example, by providing additional air defense systems or by deploying on standby some air power in the countries near Ukraine to react if Russia violates a ceasefire agreement. Could this mission be credible without American commitment if Trump says no to this proposal from the British Prime Minister?
Well, there'd be different levels of American assistance which could make all the difference. One of which is American has significant ability on what's called ISTAR. So this is the ability to look at what's happening on the ground space or other assets. And that's very, very important. And America has the facility to do that in a very big way. So that's one example of the type of military assistance that would be required. I think there's something else which has nothing to do with military assistance in the short term. But I do think that a deal needs to be under the assumption and very clear basis that to Putin and to Russia from America, that although they're not on the ground with Europeans helping to ensure this peace, he is very clear that if you come in and you do not, this is to Russia, if you breach this, whatever the agreement is, the ceasefire and the terms of it, then America will thump you very, very hard. And for all my misgivings about President Trump's behavior and language in this last sort of week, I have to remind your viewers that actually he was really quite strong in other arenas where other leaders would have hesitated during his first term in office, and would frequently go in and properly deal with countries or terrorist organizations that stepped outside of the norms. So I think he has the capacity to do that. But again, so much of this is supposition. In other words, we don't really know until we see the terms of an agreement, and there are no terms of an agreement right now.
And do you believe that such British and other French troops should fight back if they are being attacked by the Russian side? I mean, in case of this mission.
Yeah, absolutely. Of course. There shouldn't be like a sort of a UN peacekeeping, blueberry approach where you sort of scarper at the first signs of trouble or something. This has to be a proper military force. We are members of NATO. France and Britain, the European countries that are members of NATO, would be joining this. Attacking our troops would be, in my view, have to be an Article 5 moment. In other words, under NATO, and this would be our troops, so they would be NATO troops. If our troops are attacked, then it's considered to be an attack on all the countries, regardless of whether it's a French, British, or any other nationality member of the military who's attacked. So it's got to be a collective thing.
Let's also cover Russia and Russian dictator Vladimir Putin. General Budanov, head of Ukrainian military intelligence, said that Russian political and military leadership for the first time realized that it had made a terrible mistake in 2022. Do you think that Russian dictator Vladimir Putin and his generals regret invading Ukraine?
Well, they'll never say that, of course. They'll always spin it as some great success for Mother Russia. But let's be completely blunt about it. What have we learned? We've learned that the Russian army, the former Red Army, is a fraction of what the world always assumed it to be. We imagined as Western leaders that this was a really tough, capable, technologically advanced army, and they demonstrated exactly the opposite. Their vehicles got stuck in mud. Their approach to the strategy of campaigning has been appalling. They thought they'd be in Kyiv within 72 hours of the 24th of February 2022. Never mind 3 days, it's 3 years, and they're not managed to make it anywhere near Kyiv. So actually, this has been a terrible embarrassment for Russia and for Putin in particular. As I say, he'll never admit it. He'll never tell people at home why inflation is running so high in Russia, why people are suffering so much. But he has been personally responsible for disgracing Russia in the eyes of the international community, demonstrating that his military is a fraction of what everyone assumed it was, and making himself a total pariah. I think people should be ashamed to associate with.
And how we can make sure Russia will not use this time of a ceasefire just to rebuild its army, its military potential, and to attack another time in the future? And what is your take on the question of sanctions against Russian military-industrial complex in this matter after ceasefire? Can they just use this time to just build and produce more missiles?
Of course, that will be the concern. And it's very important that We do not let that happen. It's just this week, the United Kingdom has increased again sanctions against Russia. I think sanctioning another couple of hundred people, and 3 years in, we've sanctioned a lot of Russian money and people. It's important that the West carries on doing that, and certainly Europe. To answer your question, the quality of the peace discussion and agreement is really the main driver behind. I have no doubt at all that if President Putin thought that he could get away with it by rebuilding in, say, 12 or 18 months his military facilities and then being able to go in, as he would see it, for the kill and actually take over Ukraine, he'd do that. The quality of the agreement's got to be such that there is every disincentive for Putin, including those American guarantees, but most critically of all, Europe finally wakes up the threat that is the Russian bear on its eastern border and gets its own act together to spend properly on defense. And I think in that area, we are finally seeing the right kind of response. When I was defense secretary, I put our defense spending up to 2.5% of our GDP, of our economy. Unfortunately, this current government dropped that temporarily, but yesterday, the British Prime Minister Keir Starmer has come back and said, no, we will do this 2.5%, and in fact, we'll do it faster. And I strongly welcome that, but we need to go further. Most other European nations are still a long way behind us. We're by a long way the biggest spender in cash terms, and a lot of other nations need to get up to 2%, let alone 2.5%. But I do think that the one thing that Trump has done, and here I congratulate him, is taken Europe out of this era of complacency, that America will always do our dirty work. They'll always pay for it. They're not going to do that now. And Europe's understood that. And I'm seeing that finance ministers, prime ministers, presidents all around Europe have suddenly woken up to this idea. And I think we'll see a big increase, therefore, in European defense spending. And in the end, that is the thing which will stop Putin from continuing to invade Western countries.
Do you expect the United Kingdom to lift sanctions against Russia if there is a ceasefire deal?
Well, I don't expect any time soon. Again, this is too much speculation in as much as we don't know the terms of the deal. So you could see terms of a deal in which Putin agrees X, Y, Z, and we agree ABC, and therefore, part of that might be lifting of sanctions over a period of time. Personally, I feel that until Russia has paid really for perhaps some compensation for the disaster, the destruction, loss of life, which you can never bring back, we shouldn't rush to release sanctions. But again, let's wait to see the shape of the deal. Let's see if it's acceptable to you in Ukraine, and let's be guided by that and by yourselves as to when and how and if we should raise or even begin to normalize relations.
And also, do you expect the UK government to support Ukraine, provide Ukraine with another military packages if there is a ceasefire deal in place and made by both sides?
Well, one of the things that, look, I don't know the exact shape of that, but one of the things that I pioneered as a defense secretary was what I called the 100-year partnership between Ukraine and the United Kingdom. And I came up with this as a concept because clearly we have had very strong military ties during this conflict, and indeed before it, when we were already training Ukrainians in Britain after 2014, so before the main conflict in 2022. We provided anti-tank missiles, NLAWs, for the conflict, and then since the conflict, all manner of different weapons and tools. But I realized that military assistance was just really part of it. We've also welcomed Ukrainians to this country. In fact, in my own home, we had 3 Ukrainians who lived with us for a year, still in the United Kingdom, and that wasn't an exceptional story. Many Brits had Ukrainians come to live with them. And it really occurred to me that we should form a partnership, I've called it the 100-year partnership, which should go on forever, really, where we take those very strong military, the very strong social bonds between us, and we expand them into education, into science, into trade, and really standing as we do on the west and the east of continental Europe, at least the democratic part of it, we should work together to create this fantastic 100-year partnership. And I was really delighted last month or the month before when the Prime Minister, the current Prime Minister, came to Kyiv, met with President Zelensky, and pushed forward this 100-year partnership, which, as I say, I originally came up with. So I think that I don't know exactly the answer to your question on the military front. That really will depend on what the arrangements are. But I'm absolutely certain that there is a sort of closeness, a sort of bond between Brits and Ukrainians that this war has demonstrated, enlarged, and I think will now play out over many, many years.
And I would like to conclude our conversation with a final question for you regarding your political heritage and your also biggest successes and regrets. What are your biggest, from your perspective, achievements and regrets after you concluded your work as a defense secretary?
Well, I think actually, as defense secretary, my biggest achievement was a year ago. I made a speech in London at the beginning of 2024, where I said the world has changed. We've moved from a sort of post-Second World War era, post-war to pre-war era, where we need to prepare ourselves. And I called on all nations, but Europe in particular, to increase its defense spending to 2.5%. And I was able to convince our then Prime Minister, Rishi Sunak, and Chancellor to pay for that. And we set the path to 2.5%. I think that was my proudest achievement, really waking up the world to the idea we can't go on as we were. Unfortunately, as I say, there was a little bit of stuttering over that. It went backwards for the last 8 months under the current British government, but even they have now woken up to the idea and announced yesterday that we must get to that 2.5% and then 3% and higher, which I've also been calling for. So I think that would be the most significant thing. It was picked up by NATO countries, echoed by other European and international leaders. I also think, though, possibly the most long-term impact may well be the thing we were last talking about, which is, for whatever reason, there's this huge commonality of interest between Britain and Ukraine. I'm really proud of the way that we have supported you through this war. I was very struck, actually, coming to whenever I've been in Ukraine, seeing literally on the streets of Kyiv flags like the Ukrainian flag here, but sometimes intertwined with a Union Jack, the British flag. And I can't quite identify why. Maybe because during the Second World War, London suffered the Blitz when the Nazis were bombing London, just as you're being bombed even now. But there is a complete belief in Ukraine amongst British people. If you look at the polling, in other words, the opinion polls, the support for Ukraine is really as strong as it ever was today, as strong as it was when Boris Johnson first set us on this path. And it's right across parties in Parliament. So it doesn't matter whether it's a Labour government now, a Conservative government that I was part of, the British people support Ukraine. We understand what you're going through, and we want to see your democracy survive and improve and enlarge and become deeper, and we want to help you on that journey. And I think if the 100-year partnership is successful, that will by a long way be my greatest success.
Thank you, Mr. Shapps, for your time and for your support for Ukraine, and glory to Ukraine.
Slava Ukraini. You're welcome.
Slava. Thank you very much.
Thank you.